Hey everybody, it's Dr. Eric Balkavage. We're back for another edition of the Thyroid Answers podcast. And today I have a guest. I have Sara Korzeniewski. I got that close to being right. I'm Polish, so I should be able to get this stuff figured out. But, I'm like a part-time Polish person, I guess.
Yeah, I know.
So I invited Sara on the podcast. I've seen some of her posts. She talks about root cause issues. She's coming at this from a perspective that I like, but she's a dietitian. We're going to talk about what that might mean because there is, I'm going to guess that maybe what she learned in school is maybe a little bit different than what she practices in real life. So we're going to get through that stuff. But Sara, thanks for coming to the podcast. I invited you, so welcome to the podcast. So I guess basically the best place to get started is sometimes people are like, well, why would we want to listen to Sara? What does Sara have to bring? And even though this is the Thyroid Answers podcast, we talk about diet, nutrition, a whole bunch of other things, but it's always good for somebody to know the person's story who we're interviewing. So can you give a little background on who Sara is and how you got into the space?
Yeah. So as you are right, as a dietitian that's conventionally trained, started out as most dietitians do in the hospital setting, and kind of quickly realized that wasn't my thing. So spent many years trying to start my own business because to try to find a job in the functional wellness space as a dietitian is not quite as easy. But really it all started with kind of some of my own health issues, as I'm sure with a lot of people, similar stories, particularly around gut health and, hormone health and things like that. And just wasn't really satisfied with the answers I was receiving from conventional medicine. Just didn't really feel like they really cared to figure out why things were happening. And tried many different avenues, even did try some holistic practitioners and still just felt like things were being missed. So luckily I was already a dietitian and already more interested in functional medicine. So started to do a lot of my own trainings, started to get a lot more of my own education and started to really kind of put the pieces of the puzzle together. And so now that's what I help my clients be able to do, because I know how frustrating it can be and how lonely it can feel when we feel like we have problems that we really truly want to take action to get answers on, but we just don't know where to go.
Awesome. So some people may not know what the difference between a dietitian is, a nutritionist. Is there a difference, and what is the difference?
Yeah, really anybody could technically call themselves a nutritionist, even someone who's had like a 3-month training or something like that online. There's a lot of programs out there, but as a dietitian, I had to get my bachelor's of science in nutrition and dietetics. And then I had to do a internship, accredited internship, go through the internship, and then I had to pass a registered exam. And so then that allows you to be a registered dietitian.
Okay.
So, yeah.
So there's a bit of a difference there, especially from a training perspective. It doesn't necessarily mean one is better than the other. They're just a little bit different, right?
Correct.
Now it's interesting because I worked in a hospital setting for a number of years. And one of the things I thought was always curious is what we fed our people in a hospital setting, right? These chronically ill people, and what we're feeding them. It didn't make sense to me. Did you have a problem? Like, were you aware of that? Like when you're going through your training, does that kind of, you sit back and go, why, these are sick and ill people. Why are we feeding them some of this stuff?
Oh, most definitely. I think when you're, again, more conventionally trained, and the more I learned, the more aware I became of it. And even just like with tube feedings and things like that, and all of the processed sugars and things like that that are in those types of products. But it's somewhat unfortunate though, because I think that in part that's what people in the hospital want to eat. They don't really a lot of them don't necessarily have the education to realize that that's not good. I remember at a time where I was talking to a gentleman who was diabetic, and in the hospital setting, we can't provide a ton of education when it's inpatient. Like, I had a few minutes with him to kind of talk about nutrition. And then at the end of it, it was like, do you have any questions? And it was like, yeah, can I have 2 hamburgers for lunch? And so I just felt like I wasn't really making much difference, that, I was kind of there to just be there. But yeah, now, especially now that I'm really heavily into the functional medicine range, it's definitely really problematic what we feed people that are sick.
Healthy people and sick people, but that's
And
probably one of the things
yeah.
that's a big an issue, and that becomes a problem in I think in general in life, is that we give people what they want, not versus what they need to be healthy, and we say, well, it's just easier. But is it really easier? Because at the end of the day, there's a consequence to pay for easy, and usually easy usually results in problems. And when things are a little bit more difficult, I think we appreciate them more, and we get sometimes more of a benefit out of those things.
Yeah.
So let me ask you this question. If you have to look back now with your, back in time, what do you think are the 3 biggest false narratives you learned as a classically trained dietitian that you now go, man, that is not the case?
Yeah. Well, definitely classic food guide pyramid, where, the grains and carbohydrates are at the bottom of the pyramid, and it needs to be 7 to 11, servings of that per day, and all of those things. Definitely the conversation around fat not being good. Man, I lived off of, I can't believe it's not butter, for a while. And now I look back and I'm just like, why is something made in a factory better than something that comes from nature?
Yeah.
And the other one still being just that, like, red meat is a cause of all kinds of problems. And, salt is not good. Like, if you have high blood pressure, you need to cut back on the sodium intake and all of those things. And now, knowing how important minerals truly are, and that, it's oftentimes low minerals that are contributing to more blood pressure issues, that we've just we're getting so far away from what's natural.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think part of that is because it is from an allopathic perspective, and this isn't, I say this all the time, it doesn't mean that allopathic physicians are bad people or they're doing the wrong thing. They're trained a certain way, and that is to manage crisis or manage a disease process. And that's different from what we do in functional medicine. In functional medicine, what we should be doing, it's not always what's being done, but what I think we should be doing is trying to get to the root cause issues, and not just try and manipulate a lab value back into range or manipulate a symptom, but to ask the better question, which is, why is that happening? Like, okay, I have a deficiency, but do I just give that thing that's deficient, or do I ask a better question, like, why is that potentially deficient? How do I address that? Do you think about that the same way?
100%. Yeah. And especially the more I practice, the more I've really realized how much, like, even with this whole supplement thing, I mean, sometimes I have people who've gone to, like, more people who consider themselves more functional, who are taking like 25 supplements, and it's the same pill for every ill. It's just more natural, I guess. And so the more I practice, the more I actually have realized it's so much more about the foundations, and supplements really should just be used strategically to kind of help the person, but shouldn't be the way that we're managing these symptoms.
Yeah, I think what happens is we bring, a lot of us come from an allopathic model. And so we bring an allopathic philosophy to functional medicine and think that if we're switching a couple meds for a bunch of supplements, because the supplements are natural or more natural, that's a better strategy. But I don't think that's a better strategy. It probably maybe not as quickly effective, because drugs have a much faster impact typically. And I don't it's oftentimes more expensive to the client. And the third thing is, it's really, I look at it many times, it's not addressing the root cause issue anyway. And really what it is greenwashing of medicine instead of really what I think functional medicine should be, which is trying to address as much as possible the root cause. It doesn't mean that supplementations or minerals or whatever we're providing somebody isn't trying to be a stopgap sometimes, but that can't be the only thing. Like, hey, the way to fix all this thing is 20 supplements a day. That's how you fix it. That's, I think, a recipe for more problems. And it's the wrong philosophy. It's not really functional medicine.
Right. Yeah. And like really from my perspective, because I, focus a lot on gut health as well, that really if your gut is inflamed, supplements can continue to add fuel to the fire because, there's a lot of stuff in supplements, the capsules, any fillers that are in there, those types of things. And then oftentimes people are taking, a form of a nutrient or something that's not even really being absorbed all that well or not utilized by the body. And we also have to remember that nutrients don't work in isolation. So we could be, like you said, doing more harm than good because we're maybe throwing another nutrient out of whack by taking something that we don't even need altogether, something that's causing more harm or just not even getting enough of something in, but yet we think we're covered because we're taking a supplement.
Yeah, so I think you may have read my notes before I got there, because that's one of the things I'm going to ask you at the end. I saved that question for the end. Like, give me like the three biggest, like, kind of misconceptions about like, oh, everybody needs to be doing this. So we'll save that for the end. Okay. But when I look at things, when I look at physiology, I'm typically looking through the lens of something called the cell danger response. Mm-hmm. And I want to know, when I'm looking at labs, when I'm looking at a person, I think before I can provide a treatment strategy, right, I need to ask myself a question about the person. And that is this a person who's in homeostasis, or is this a person who's in allostasis? And so do you look at a person's physiology the same way, or do you make the assumption that there is no difference in how they regulate their physiology? Everybody's physiology regulates the same way all the time. Or do you go, this is a person who is operating from a different mode? And that's when I look at that, that's where I bring the cell danger response in. So are you familiar with that cell danger response? And do you look at people from a similar view?
Yes. So cell danger response mode is definitely something I've learned about even more so in the last year. And in part because I've really found, I think that in a lot of cases, and not all cases, that health issues are becoming so much more chronic and so much more complex. And I think all too often we kind of try to fix these chronic issues from like an acute perspective. And so I always try to tell clients, like, this is not like you have a broken arm and we have to fix it. We put a cast on it for a few weeks and you're good to go. Like, we have to look at how your body's functioning at a cellular level. And so what I was seeing is that people would come to me thinking, I'm doing everything. I've changed my diet. I ran labs. I'm taking, all these supplements and things. And yeah, maybe I'm sprinkling in some, exercise and some stress reduction in there, but I'm still not better. And so then really discovered the whole cell danger response perspective and the fact that, there's a lot more to it than just that. And if your cells are stuck in that cell danger response, then yeah, you're never really going to get back into balance. So we have to take an even deeper step back and be like, what's happening at that cellular level?
Yeah. So for the listener, do you feel comfortable kind of giving a simple explanation, how you would explain it to your clients of what that cell danger response is? Because somebody might be going, I don't even know what that means.
Yes, I can do my best. So really, I tell people that, health starts at a cellular level, but illness also starts at a cellular level. So it's like all about the cells. And your body is made up of trillions of cells, those cells make up your organs. The organs make up the organ systems. The organ systems make up your entire body. And your cells have mitochondria in them, which are the little powerhouses of the cells that help make ATP for energy. And your mitochondria have lots of jobs, but I say kind of the two most essential functions are to, convert the nutrients from the foods we eat, digest, and assimilate into that usable energy for our cells in the form of ATP. And the second biggest, most essential function is to monitor our internal and our external environment for threats. So those threats can come from, again, so many different places. It could be poor sleep and, a dysfunctional circadian clock, infections, toxins, physical, mental, emotional traumas, could be ongoing psychological distress, poor lifestyle habits, all of those types of things. And so your mitochondria can't do both at the same time. They can't monitor for threats and make energy. Your body only has so much resources, can't do everything all the time. It's not a huge on the multitasking. So it's going to pick and choose what it thinks is most essential for survival, and monitoring for threats and kind of trying to heal and those types of things is going to trump energy production. So then that mitochondria switch off from energy production to its biggest job is just trying to ensure your survival. And so that can cause that low cellular energy, which those cells can't function, and then everything else can take a hit.
Yeah, I think that's a good explanation. And, for the clients, especially since this is the Thyroid Answers podcast, we talk about chronic hypothyroid signs and symptoms and people struggling. And what Sara's talking about is, I'll maybe phrase it a different way, is that cells are operating like people in two modes, right? They're either in a low stress mode and they're operating in manufacturing mode. Like, I'm making energy and proteins and enzymes and peptides and skin and hair, and they're making stuff, right? And to do that, they need a high energy state. So they want a high T3 state, because T3 binding to the receptors at the nucleus, at the mitochondria, turns on energy production and turns on manufacturing. And we feel good, right? And we burn a lot of fuel in that situation. And the other thing that's important about the high T3 state inside the cell is that inside the cell, T3 binds to receptors that turn on manufacturing, and T3 binds to receptors that turn off the cell defense mechanisms and cell danger. And as Sara said, when a cell is in a low stress state, it's more about manufacturing, and it wants to keep the immune inflammatory process low. But when a cell perceives a threat or perceives danger, now it's saying, whoa, we got to change things here. We're going to be less focused on the manufacturing process and more focused on the cell defense mechanisms. And to do that, it initiates this, what we call a cell danger response, which is a cascade of changes at the cell that kind of stiffen the cell off, reduce the transport of nutrients into the cell, sometimes accelerate the metabolism of nutrients. And part of that cell defense mechanism is a low T3 state. It's not a mistake, but it's an adaptive change, because when I have a low T3 state, then I have less T3 to bind to receptors to turn on manufacturing, and I have less T3 to bind to receptors to turn off the immune inflammatory response. And now activity and things occur and the focus changes. So the issue that I see is that we have so many people treating everybody as if they're in a low stress state. Like, hey, let's just give them more and more thyroid hormone. It should work, right? Let's just give them more vitamin D. It should work. Let's just give them more of this nutrient because they're deficient. And as we learn from Dr. Navio and from his studies and research, under certain conditions, the body is trying to sometimes metabolize things, get rid of them so they're not beneficial. A cell that's in a danger response doesn't want a lot of glucose in it. And so that triggers decreased glucose transport. So we call glucose resistance. It also can trigger that insulin not to work well. We call insulin resistance. And there's other nutrients that may become depleted faster or metabolized differently than we would expect. And sometimes they look like just deficiencies to somebody who doesn't look through that lens. And the thought process is I'll just fill it up instead of saying, hey, why is that occurring? Do you agree with that kind of assessment?
Yes, very much. That was spot on.
So when we talk about thyroid world, right, we hear a lot of people talk about that hypothyroidism is really caused by just nutritional. Sometimes people think about nutritional deficiencies. Like the reason you have hypothyroidism is because you're iodine deficient, or the reason that you're deficient is because you're iron deficient, or the reason you have low T3 is because you're just selenium deficient. And all we need to do is give you our magic supplement, thyroid supplement formulation, and that's going to restore physiology. What's your take on that? Like, how do you look at a thyroid problem in particular? Are you looking at the thyroid issue each person individually? Or are you looking at it like, yeah, it makes sense. It's an iodine deficiency because you need iodine. It's they're not converting because they're selenium deficient. Where do you stand on that?
I think it goes much deeper than that. I really think it's much more complex than that, because then I start, again, like you said in the beginning, start thinking, well, even if they are selenium deficient, even if they are iodine deficient, why? Why is that happening? Because sure, we could look at the diet and say, well, maybe they're not eating, foods that contain those types of nutrients. But then I start thinking about, well, what's the state of their gut health like? Because are they even breaking down foods properly? Are they even absorbing nutrients and things like that? Then I start thinking, okay, well, even if we take a look at their minerals and we see some of these deficiencies, again, is there something else going on with other minerals? Because even things like toxic metals, like mercury, for example, is one of those things that can actually bind to selenium. It can start to lower zinc. It can also start to waste magnesium. And all three of those minerals will impact the thyroid, but then it's like, okay, well, you have mercury. All right, well, we got to remineralize as part of that. But like, how is that person detoxing? Are they still exposing? Do they have fillings in their mouth that they're, still getting exposed to that needs to be addressed? So it's like constantly peeling back the layers. And as soon as you feel like you figured out a layer, there's usually a layer underneath it that still kind of needs some addressing to some degree. But then we never want to, because even if the gut is dysfunctional, it's like, okay, but why is that dysfunctional? How's their nervous system? Have they been under a lot of stress? Do they have a lot of trauma, emotional things? Because that is a typical area that is often overlooked. And so it just kind of keeps going deeper and deeper and deeper to really try to address those whys.
Yeah. And for the person who's listening and maybe like, just give me the easy answer. Okay, what do I need? An electrolyte formula? Like, what do I need? Like, can I just take a multivitamin? Oh, you can do all of those things, but it doesn't mean they're going to work. And I think sometimes the thing we see is somebody sees a B6 deficiency or a B12 deficiency and says, well, just give more B12. And then they don't get the benefit from it, or they react negatively to it. And then they go, oh, I think I'm sensitive to B6 or I'm sensitive to B12, when they maybe don't realize, and the physician as well, or the practitioner as well, doesn't realize that, oh, when I give them that nutrient, I wanted to do X, but the body and the cells, because they're in danger mode, are doing Y with it. Like it's going in a different direction. We always look like, hey, I'm going to give it and it's going to do this thing at the cell. Like we can kind of steer it in its direction. And that's not really what happened. Cells use nutrients based on what's their priority, not your priority, right?
Yep.
So if we talk about micronutrients and we talk about nutrient deficiencies, how does Sara go about assessing somebody to find out if they have a nutritional deficiency? There's a lot of tests on the market. We don't have to necessarily use names of companies, but like everybody has different strategies. So what do you think is how can somebody determine if they have a micronutrient deficiency, or if they're going to somebody in functional medicine, what's a good clue that person is actually maybe doing appropriate testing to tell them that they have a nutritional deficiency?
Yeah, I know everyone kind of has their opinion. Well, my favorite way to at least start that process is looking at a hair tissue mineral analysis test. And then using kind of my training and all of that to help assess more of what's happening at a cellular level. You know, some will use that in combination with certain blood tests and things like that. But really, blood is just a transport medium when it comes to nutrients. And so, you know, the blood also has to remain at a constant pH. So it's often pushing and pulling minerals and things like that in and out of the cell to help assess, you know, to keep it at that balance. And so it's not always a reflection of really what's happening at a cellular level, especially when we're talking minerals. And oftentimes when a mineral shows up low on the blood test, it's probably at pretty critical low levels in the cell. So that's kind of what I like to use because you know, sometimes clients even will come and say, oh, my doctor said that I was high in a certain nutrient in the blood. And it's like, okay, but does that mean that doesn't necessarily mean what's happening at a cell? Sometimes we can still be deficient at a cellular level, but also something's showing up high in the blood. So that's kind of what I like to look at, because the nice thing about the hair tissue mineral test and being able to really assess it properly is I'm also taking the client into account. Does this make sense? Because typically in certain presentations with minerals, we often see certain physical symptoms or even like personality types, you know, symptoms. Does this make sense? And, you know, 99% of the time they're like, yep, you just described me to a T. And it's like, okay, great. I've got that information too. I don't want to just interpret a lab and treat the lab. You know, taking the client into account is really important.
Yeah. And I think the big challenge I see, I mean, I love looking at blood work, but the problem is, as you pointed out, blood work needs to be interpreted, not read. And so too many people read a lab report and go, oh, if that's normal, that means what's going on in the cell is appropriate. And that's not necessarily the case. I mean, you know, thyroid physiology is a great example of that. Well, TSH is normal, so thyroid physiology must be appropriate in all the cells of the body. No, the TSH is really representing potentially what's happening at the hypothalamus and pituitary, but not all the cells and tissues in the body can't do that. And there's a separate regulatory system at every tissue and every cell for how to regulate those things. So that becomes the issue. And I think we see that with a bunch of different things, and we may have differing opinions on those, but I think we look at different tests and we go, oh, that's everybody's low on this, or everybody's ferritin's low, so that therefore everybody's needs iron, or everybody's vitamin D 25 OHD is low, so therefore everybody needs 25 OHD. And we can't, that's what gets people in trouble. We need to interpret those results based on patient signs and symptoms, maybe other labs that we've run. But when we look at values on the labs, we can say, okay, the 25 OHD is low, but that doesn't necessarily mean I need to give that person vitamin D. That what that requires a good, at least from a functional medicine perspective, is to ask the next questions, which is, okay, is this a person who gets no sunlight? Is this a person that has gut issues and can't absorb fat or fat soluble nutrients? Is this a person who maybe has a magnesium deficiency and they're deficient because they need magnesium to get vitamin D to the liver and from the gut to be converted into 25 OHD? Is this a person who has low vitamin D because they're overly deactivating it because the body is trying to get rid of it? Is this a person who's overly converting it to the active form because there's some type of immune inflammatory process? And so I just don't see necessarily that gets done. So in your world, in your practice, are you looking at labs the same way, health history, health timeline, labs, and then looking at, okay, what are the potential reasons this may be deficient? And maybe instead of focusing on the micronutrient to fill it up artificially, maybe I need to focus on why.
100%. Yeah, I think that's the ultimate long-term most effective way to gain our health back is that. because yeah, short-term fixes for some people can make them feel better, but yeah, they're going to make you feel better in the short term,
Yeah.
not the long term. And, most of us want to feel better long term. We don't want to keep chasing these symptoms and, all of those types of things. And it's now our full-time job. And so, yeah, the vitamin D thing, yeah, I think it's just become that, like, sure, vitamin D is important, but aren't all nutrients important? Like, aren't all hormones important? Like, everything's important. Why are we hyper focusing on some of these kind of smaller factors?
And I think there's an easy answer for that one, because it's easily manipulated and people feel good about the easy manipulation, just like we do in thyroid hormone. Somebody says, oh, that allopathic physician doesn't know what they're talking about because they're only looking at TSH and free T4. And if they looked at free T3 or reverse T3, they would see they're not converting T4 to T3 efficiently. So I'm a better physician. I'm going to give them T3. And guess what? You can normalize T3, but it may not change the patient's signs or symptoms, because even though you gave them T3, the cells typically do the conversion of T4 to T3. So just artificially putting it into the bloodstream doesn't mean that I'm going to get the impact of that, or that I changed the physiology that created the low T3 state. We need to step back and say, you know what? That's still an allopathic approach. And maybe what I need to do is ask the better question as to why are the cells and tissues not converting it? Is it broken physiology, or is it adaptive physiology?
Yes, absolutely.
So there are lots, I think we already covered it, but even regardless of the type of test somebody does, a SpectraCell test, a hair mineral analysis test, and they find out they have nutritional deficiencies. And I think this is an important thing for practitioners, and you may have figured this out as well, that oftentimes on those types of tests, they give recommendations like take this much vitamin D, take this much B, take this much C, take this. Why does that cause problems for some people? Or do you find that the solutions that are often provided on those reports work out really well?
Yeah. That's never anything I would recommend or do myself, as far as the lab saying something, because again, the lab doesn't know the person and doesn't know the situation. It only knows the lab. Because even with like the hair tissue, because certain minerals can even show up looking high, which, again, could be similar to a deficiency, but it could also be causing problems. Like when we see high calcium on a hair tissue mineral, which is a little more common than we realize, like that's actually because calcium and magnesium, need to be doing their jobs at the cellular level. But then we take a look and we see like sodium and potassium are low, which happens a lot because of adrenal dysfunction. And who's under stress? Who has adrenal dysfunction? Like, again, vast majority of people. And like sodium and potassium are solvent minerals. And so they actually help other minerals and other nutrients fluidly move in and out of the cell. So they can also then start to affect calcium and magnesium. So there's nutrient relationships that we have to understand. And so like, even when the case of magnesium is a very popular one these days. Everybody needs to take magnesium. Like, you'll see that everywhere. But it also isn't talking as much about the cofactors that actually require magnesium to do its job properly, so that it can actually start staying in the cell and you can kind of reap the benefits from it. And so we're not really talking about those types of things. So then what I see is clients are taking, a boat ton of magnesium, but now the magnesium is really high on a hair tissue mineral, which doesn't mean they're taking too much. It means it's not getting in the cell because they don't have the right cofactors that go with it. And we also don't consider the fact that there are also nutrient antagonists, things that work against each other. We also have to remember that your body requires nutrients to process other things and other nutrients. And so you could be burning up something that you're not replacing by taking, this random supplement that some sort of lab told you. But again, then I go back to, great, you could take a supplement, but are you absorbing it? Are you still under so much stress that your body's burning through it faster than you can replace it? And what about looking at foods? Are you eating nutrient dense, bioavailable forms of foods? Maybe we start there instead of always just, replacing it with a supplement. I talked to a nurse one time who worked in surgery, and she actually told me they would cut people open all the time and see like whole pills of like supplements in their gut, So supplements are man-made, even if they're natural. And we have to remember that. Nature created things to have a lot of these nutrients in there that work together. And that's always kind of the best place to start if you can.
Yeah, in my early days when I was just really doing chiropractic care and we were taking a lot of x-rays, it was not unusual to do a lumbar shot of somebody and see little capsule shaped things in their colon, right? And you'd be people like, and I'd circle it as I'm on the x-ray, and then I explain what's going on, and they were like, yeah, but what's this thing you have circled here? I'm like, what do you think that looks like? Looks like a pill or a capsule. I'm like, yeah. Do you take like a multivitamin or anything? Yeah, I take I won't necessarily mention name, but some of the real popular commercial multivitamins, and you go, yeah, that I only need one of those per day because they're so good. Yeah, that's it right there. Well, it's like the same shape when it went in. Where's that in my body? That's your colon. It's just getting ready to come out.
Right.
Well, how do I get the benefit from that if it's in the same shape?
Right.
Yeah, that's the point, right? So supplementation is not as simple. No, but not all the quality of ingredients and fillers and all the stuff we talked about before could be problematic. But let's talk about in general, or you can push this towards thyroid physiology. What would you say are like the three? Let's go with the three most common deficiencies that you typically see, and maybe how somebody might go about addressing them, because they're probably the three most popular things that anybody's been told they have a deficiency in. But what do you typically see?
So the three typical ones I see are, because there's a few that I focus on kind of first because they can definitely impact other nutrients, are magnesium, sodium, and potassium.
Okay, good. I was going to say, I'm going to preface that by saying we're going to talk about the three biggest nutritional deficiency fallacies that you see, but let's talk about the three things that you see most commonly that are legit, that are problematic.
Yeah, so magnesium, sodium, potassium are typically the biggest ones I see, and partly because sodium and potassium are regulated by the adrenal glands. And so when we're under stress and the adrenal glands kick in and they release stress hormones like cortisol, also they release stress hormones like aldosterone, which is a little bit less talked about. That actually causes us to kind of burn through more of that sodium, and the body's going to try to keep things in balance. So then it starts burning potassium because it's trying to keep them kind of, balanced, right? And so we typically under stress, the body stress response in part is to increase blood pressure to try to flee from danger, even if we're not having to run away from something. And so we use sodium and potassium to help regulate blood pressure. And potassium in particular is one of the nutrients that really has kind of the highest recommended dietary intake that's even set by the government, which is like 4,500 milligrams or so a day. And that's kind of the highest. And so that typically is very low, in part because of stress. So we want to not just work on getting potassium into the diet. And a lot of people think of bananas, but I'm like, a banana only has like 400 milligrams. So that's not enough to cover. Like you really have to do more than that. But then you also have to work on the stressors that are causing you to burn through those more significantly. And sodium is another big one too, because in our modern day society, we've kind of been taught to fear salt, and getting some good quality mineral rich salt is actually really important. To even hydrate, because it's like I always say, water doesn't hydrate us. It's really the minerals that hydrate us, because you've got to be able to draw that fluid into your cell. Otherwise, you're just dehydrated at a cellular level. You're drinking all this water and you're either still really thirsty, or you're just constantly peeing because it's not, retaining inside of the cell. So I usually recommend clients start adding more salt. Even sometimes they need to add salt to their water to really get more sodium, but other minerals in as well.
How dare you? I mean, people, have you not heard anything on the news? Salt is what's killing people
Oh
today.
my gosh. I know,
So
right?
yeah, I'm in the same camp. And I think it's funny. You touched on the dehydration thing. So I'm going to add a little piece to that. You can agree with it or disagree with it, but you see a lot of people who have chronic thirst issues, right? We talk about with diabetes and chronic thirst issues. But I try and explain to people that when we have that cell stress or cell danger response, part of what the cell is doing is kind of walling itself off. It's not bringing in the same nutrients that it would be if it was in a low stress state, because, hey, there's a threat here. Maybe there's a bacteria or virus, and the cell is saying, hey, we're not bringing more glucose in. We're not bringing more nutrients in. We're not going to do more things that's going to help that bacteria, that virus kind of thrive in that environment. So we're going to make it as unhospitable as possible so that we can find this thing and kill it, right? And one of the things is, we talked about the T3 gets downregulated, and that downregulates mitochondria. And for the listeners, we eat food, we convert that food energy, as Sara said, to cellular energy, and the kind of the currency is what we call ATP. Now, what a lot of people don't realize is that when we don't make, or the byproduct of making ATP is cellular water. So if you're in a low T3 state, if you're not making a lot of ATP, you're also probably not generating a lot of cellular water, and that may too have an impact. So between, as Sara's saying, hey, I got less minerals fluxing in and out of the cell, therefore having an impact on fluid concentration, my mitochondria also aren't generating cellular water as a byproduct of that ATP production. And that too can trigger this state of, I'm constantly thirsty. And we think we're doing ourselves some good. I'm hydrating. Even the person who's uber focused on hydration, but now you're peeing a lot, right? And Sara was talking about, kind of burning through stuff. Your kidney, your renal system, your kidneys, really important. And adrenals play a role in that piece of as we're peeing out stuff, we're also pulling some of those minerals back into the system to be reused. But if we're flooding the system with fluids, we may be losing that stuff. If we're stressed, we may be losing that stuff instead of recycling. Is that fair to say?
Yes, for sure.
So we talk about minerals, and if we're going to address them, you said, hey, if there's these deficiencies, maybe before you jump to supplementation, you look at, hey, what's going on that may be preventing me from absorbing them? What might be causing me to burn through those things faster, and maybe address those things. And if you do those two things, maybe you don't need to overload with a whole bunch of supplementation, right?
Yeah. Focus on, some food sources too, if you can,
Which is always better, right?
Yeah.
Because there's unknown things in the food that we don't realize how nutrients work together. And there's a number of things from a micronutrient standpoint that if you overload on something, I'm just going to take a whole bunch of zinc, right?
Yeah.
It's in yin and yang with something else. So zinc and copper need to be in ratio. Vitamin A, vitamin D need to have a certain ratio. So what would you say would be maybe the 3 most common deficiencies that people are told they have that maybe they don't really have? It's just improper interpretation maybe of some labs.
Well, the vitamin D is a very common thing. And, again, we have to remember the body is a very smart thing, smarter than we probably even still have yet to learn in certain cases. And so is the body purposely lowering vitamin D for another reason? And, I see that sometimes with calcium or even just with chronic illness, does that need to be addressed? Is it a magnesium deficiency? Because we often don't look at the storage form of vitamin D. We're only looking at active forms and things like that. And so then the problem becomes is that sometimes I see people, especially getting on those prescription vitamin Ds that are like tens of thousands of international units. And then of course they were never told to like when to stop it. Do I retest it? Like that kind of thing. And then they end up with like calcification of their joints, in their hands. I've seen that before where they're like, because it's like, oh, my doctor just told me to take this and I just took it because that's what they said. So again, not really considering all those other relationships with like vitamin D and even calcium. And deficiencies that they're told.
I'll tell you what, you think about the next one. I want to add a little piece to the vitamin D that maybe some of the listeners don't know about, and maybe it'll tie into maybe another thing that you're going to think about. But when you take vitamin D, you take high dose vitamin D, there tends to be a drop in vitamin A. And so that can impact something called iron regulation, which Sara may bring up as one of those things, because hey, everybody's anemic, right? I have a beef with that one too. But I think when people are chronically vitamin D deficient, and it's important for people to know that typically what's being measured is traditionally just 25-OHD, which is the circulating storage form of vitamin D. What doesn't get measured is the activated form, the 125 form of vitamin D. That's the one that binds to your receptors and does all the action. But there's this idea that everybody's deficient, but we're not measuring. All we're measuring is the circulating storage form, and we're not determining whether we're able to convert it or we're activating or deactivating. We only have that. Typically only one piece is being measured, so it can be measured differently. But interesting for the listener, because this is people, a lot of people have thyroid issues, they have weight issues, and like they're taking vitamin D on a regular basis, and yet they're always deficient on their 25-OHD. Where's it going? What's happening to it? And I ask that question all the time, like, you're taking it, where do you think it's going? And they don't know. And I'm like, what the literature today shows is that it goes someplace, and where a lot of that 25-OHD goes is to your fat cells. And people thought for a while that it just got stored there and it didn't do anything. And now we know that it actually does something, and it's trying to help when it gets to the fat cell. And one of the things it'll do is try to reduce the inflammation that's caused within the fat cell. So if you're not getting your food nutrients into the cells and tissues that can burn it, we got to put it somewhere, so it's going to go into the fat cell. And if you crowd all this food energy into this fat cell, that can trigger kind of inflammatory changes. Here comes vitamin D to the rescue. It gets there and it converts to the activated form. And now, instead of having one fat cell, I make 10 fat cells. And so now that sounds like, wait a minute, did you just say it made me more fat cells? Yeah, that's the body's way to help the solution, to provide a solution. If I make more fat cells, then I have less crowding, I have less inflammation, and that can be beneficial. The problem is that's great if you stop consuming, but if you're not consuming and you still have a cell stress response going on, now you have more fat cells, now you have more storage vesicles to store more calories, and you can start to gain more body fat. So it sounds like, hey, just everybody's deficient. But in my time frame of working with people with vitamin D, a lot of times, especially if they're struggling with weight issues and they've been taking vitamin D consistently, and yet their values are always low and they're gaining weight, I'll say, just stop the vitamin D for a while. Let's see what happens. Hey, I feel better and I'm not gaining weight as quickly. Is there any correlation there? And it does appear to be some correlation. So I don't know if you've heard that or seen some of that. I've been talking about that for a while. Now I'm starting to see more people start to discuss, maybe there's an issue with everybody taking high dose vitamin D, and maybe we're not as aware. But that's one mechanism where it could be potentially problematic.
Yeah.
So give me number 2.
So you brought up a good one, the iron issue. So
everybody's anemic, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. 25% of the population's anemic, despite the fact that we have been fortifying our foods, some of our processed foods and grains and things like that with all this iron. Yeah. Iron is a big topic. But yeah, again, I always go back to the, well, why are you low? Because that is what I see is, either they're just also checking ferritin, which, isn't the complete picture. And then just trying to supplement based on that. But then again, they're not asking why ferritin is low. Maybe they've asked, okay, well, you're not bleeding, you don't have a heavy period or something, that kind of thing. And then here's a bunch of iron. But what we know is that, again, iron needs other cofactors to work appropriately. So is that a case? Copper is one of them. And I often find copper issues with clients because iron gets recycled in the body. So we don't really need to take a lot of it orally. And we're not able to get rid of a lot of high doses of iron a day either. So then it can start to accumulate. But then I also start thinking of, okay, well, iron also feeds pathogens, right? So is there a gut issue? Are there pathogens that are either eating up the iron or the body is hiding iron as a protection mechanism? But then if we start taking all this iron, are we creating more dysfunction in the digestive tract?
Yep.
And then there's the anemia of chronic disease or anemia of inflammation. So is that a factor?
And I would argue that anemia of chronic inflammation is the bigger cause of what looks like an anemia pattern than iron deficiency anemia. I mean, there's some experts that say it's almost impossible to have an iron deficiency if you're eating animal protein and you have a standard diet and you're not bleeding out. Okay. Even if you have a menstrual cycle. I think for me, when we look at iron physiology, I hear so many people to me, it's a myth that, and I learned it, but that ferritin levels need to be somewhere around 90 for optimal health. And to me, that's crazy talk based on my literature and research and review, because ferritin is more of a tissue protein, not a serum protein. And so somebody says, why are you taking all this iron? Well, because my ferritin's low. Well, good. That probably means you don't have a lot of tissue damage, but my doctor says I'm anemic. Okay, well, you can't really determine the anemia pattern by just looking at your ferritin. You have to look at a soluble transferrin receptor test, and that's going to help you distinguish, because an iron deficiency anemia could look very much like an anemia of chronic inflammation if ferritin's low in both. But what I typically see a lot of, and maybe you do as well, is that somebody has a lower iron, maybe a lower saturation, but a higher ferritin level. And that's usually a good indication, hey, I've got an issue with anemia of inflammation and not a true iron deficiency anemia. I was taught ferritin needed to be in the 90 range for optimal health. And early on in my career, I messed up a lot of people by trying to force ferritin levels up into a 90 range. And then I started reading the works of Douglas Kell, and I was like, whoa. This guy is saying something totally different. And then you look at others in his field and you go, whoa, what am I doing here? Right. And so I think that's one of the biggies is iron regulation, and everybody's is iron deficient. And I don't think we assess it right. Just like I don't think we assess vitamin D appropriately. How about the third? You got a third?
That one's tough. Yeah. I mean, I would say a good fair of people come to me, even just on multivitamins, even though that's not a single nutrient. I'm not the biggest fan of multivitamins because, again, I think like we talked about, they're trying to cram all these things into one pill. But again, there's often iron in multivitamins, and, there's often kind of crappy forms of things. There's probably vitamin D, in there. So people kind of take those things thinking, well, I'm covered. I've got all my nutrients and things like that. But again, you have to understand the relationships and how they work, and also what you need, and do you truly need it? And then the other flip side of like, are you even getting enough of something? Because like they can only put so much in there. And oftentimes, like with magnesium, our needs are much higher than what we might put in a multivitamin. So I just think we need to do more custom with everybody instead of just try to blanket cover them with nutrients.
Yeah. And I'll add, like, I think would be key things for people to understand is looking at blood levels of B9, B12 directly, and just trying to make a decision, is my folic acid a reflection of what's happening of my B9 status in my cell? The answer is No. And is B12 a good sign of what's happening inside my cells and tissues? No. So those are the two really common tests that I'll see physicians run: folic acid, and say, hey, your folic acid needs to be greater than 10 or whatever. When in reality, folic acid you can take folic acid, which is a form of B9, but often if you look at some of the work of some of those in folate physiology, they'll tell you that when we're measuring folic acid, we're measuring oxidized folate, and that is not really what's reflective. That's not a good thing to have a high level of. And two, we see a lot of people who are taking vitamins, especially B12, and they'll have normal levels of B12, and a doctor will assume that that means they have sufficient B12 in their cells, and it's probably one of the worst markers to assess what's going on in the cells. There are other blood values we can look at just on a regular blood test, not even doing a micronutrient test, but look at the red blood cell indices, look at homocysteine, and we can get a better reflection of what's happening with the B12. We could run methylmalonic acid. It gives us a better reflection of what's happening with B12 inside the cell. So you can't just look at the blood values. And Sara said that like right off the bat in the beginning, that, hey, sometimes the blood values of things aren't a good reflection of what's in the cell. That's where you want a good physician who can help you, a good practitioner who can, even if you have a blood panel, if they know how to interpret labs, they can see that, hey, this is a pattern of malabsorption. You don't need 20 different micronutrients. You need to fix the malabsorption issue. That's our first strategy. Or these 4 tests all indicate that you're not getting the B12 to your cell, or the B9 to your cell, or the magnesium to the tissue, or the calcium. So those are the things that Sara was trying to kind of convey through the podcast. Is it's not so simple just to look at a lab report. It doesn't even matter if it's a micronutrient report. When you're hiring your functional practitioner to help you, what you want is a good detective, a person who can interpret. It may not always be easy to do that on, like, how do I know? But they should have conversations with you more along the lines of, we got to figure out why this is deficient versus rushing to, we're just going to replace. Would you agree with that, Sara?
I definitely would. And I mean, I also kind of really caution people when even if they're not seeing a functional practitioner, they're just seeing, oh, someone said that, they took this, or, oh, I should be taking this. And so then they start blindly supplementing without even having any sort of labs or anything like that to make sure people, again, know that, are you addressing underlying root causes? And B, you could be doing more harm than good, even if it's a quote unquote natural product, which that doesn't even guarantee anything. Because like, a product could say it's organic and only have 10% organic products and 90% of it synthetic, So we have to just be smart with what we put inside of our bodies.
Yeah. And that's a whole nother, what labeling is a whole nother podcast on its own, because there's so much misinformation that goes on with labeling today. People fight for, hey, it's natural, it's gluten-free, therefore everybody thinks it's healthy or whatever. So I want to be conscious of the time. I've got a bunch more questions, but we're not going to get through them today. So maybe the best thing to do is invite you to come back on another episode of the podcast sometime in the future. We kind of finish this discussion and maybe get into what's going on in the gut and absorption of things. But for the listeners who are intrigued about the conversation, want to learn more about Sara, where do they go? Where can they hear more about you, what you do? Maybe if they want to work with you to get more guidance, where can they go?
So my website is The Organic Dietitian, and I always say dietitian is spelled with a T, not a C. It's always misspelled. That's okay. And then I am also The Organic Dietitian on Facebook and Instagram. I spend a lot of time on Instagram and all of that, so they can always reach me there.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you coming on the podcast and helping kind of get some of this information out there, and look forward to maybe having you on a future episode.
Great. Would love to. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody. And for those who are listening, please listen to the podcast. Give us a rating if you appreciate the podcast, and please share it with friends and family. Take care, everybody.